Good morning to the designing audience, respected speakers of the day, and Anekdhara team. Anekdhara is a public policy portal started in November 2021 by a few retired civil servants. We share a progressive worldview aiming to make more space for informed discussion and exchange of ideas. Accordingly, we hold monthly webinars. Today's topic is India's composite culture. Please visit our website and give your suggestions. Dante is said to have said, the hottest places in hell are reserved for those who, in time of moral crisis, preserve their neutrality. We are concerned with the hell or heaven here and now. We are also keen in containing the hellfire of intolerance in whatever small way we can, as the revolutionary Telugu poet Sri Sri says, Nenu Saitam Prapanchagniki Samidhanokkati Ahutichanu. It means, even I too offered a sacrificial twig for the world purifying fire. We fancy handling the threat of global warming that is making the material world hellish is easier than handling the cultural fire which is swiftly and steadily surrounding the human forests. It is especially shocking in India of Sagaram Pratigachati fame. Sagaram Pratigachati figuratively means all life will merge into the one cosmic ocean. Whether the five elements or the Panchabhuta theory is scientifically tenable or not, it is undeniable that many cultures, particularly in the present world, are composite cultures. India is unique in claiming and being viewed by others, and truly also composite in all the aspects of its culture, as Kabir said, I am not a Hindu, nor a Muslim am I. I am this body, a play of five elements, a drama of the spirit dancing with joy and sorrow. If it is so, isn't we versus they the highest form of ignorance? Having said that, it is also important to note that Hindu and Muslim, despite being the dominant generic components of the Indian composite culture, there are many other elements, religious and otherwise, that make our culture typically Indian. This complex tapestry is as conspicuously colorful, as stupendously subtle to understand, let alone appreciate. While the first speaker, Professor Kumkum Roy, will speak on the complexities of a composite culture, insights from an old story. The complexities of a composite culture, insights from an old story. The second speaker, Professor Vinay Lal, will speak on the composite culture of India in modern times and the perils of homogenization. His concern seems surely that some insane elements are hard at gnawing the moorings of our composite culture. Our first speaker, Professor Kumkum Roy, did her PhD in ancient Indian history from the Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. She taught for several years at the Center for Historical Studies, JNU. Her specialization is in ancient Indian history. Her areas of interest include histories of political institutions and processes and issues of gender. Her publications include The Emergence of Monarchy in North India, The Power of Gender and Gender of Power, and Historical Dictionary of Ancient India. She is also interested in issues of pedagogy at various levels. She was awarded the Commonwealth Fellowship in 1994. She was a fellow at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla, in 1998, and a fellow at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, New Delhi, during 2015 and 16. Over to you, Ma'am, Professor Rai, to enlighten us on the complexities of the composite culture, insights from an old story.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gagarin, and the entire team of Anekdhara for inviting me. Professor Lal and friends, I would now like to begin my presentation. I would like to begin by stating that the phrase composite culture, as well as unity in diversity, are quickly losing their sheen in our present context? Is it because they have outgrown their usefulness? Or is it because they have they masked certain differences that now seem to be developing into chasms, fissures that appear unbridgeable at times? Can we move to the second slide? I will begin by touching briefly on recent scholarship. The concept of Bharatvarsha and other essays by B.D. Chattopadhyay addresses some of the issues that concern us today, drawing on the complex and somewhat contentious traditions of the past. Two essays in this anthology, Accommodation and Negotiation in a Culture of Exclusivism, Some Early Indian Perspectives, and Interrogating Unity in Diversity, Voices from India's Ancient Texts, are particularly relevant to the present discussion. The next one. Now, in his introduction to the first essay, Chattopadhyay points out that the notion of the composite, implying intermingling or sankara, would have been considered anathema within the Brahmanical tradition in ancient India. Moving beyond this, he presents us with a more complex scenario, one within which Indian society developed through contradiction, accommodation, and negotiation. Chattopadhyay begins by pointing out two representations of difference that were often regarded as irreconcilable. Drawing on the evidence of early Vedic texts, these would include those who identified themselves as the Aryans and designated others as Dasas or Dasyus. In later traditions, forest dwellers were often regarded as distinct from and hostile to settled populations. There are other indications of difference, including sectarian differences. As is well known, sectarian conflict is alluded to in Ashoka's famous Major Rock Edict 12, which contains the ruler's plea and suggestions to reduce, if not eliminate, such conflicts. The next one. Chattopadhyay goes on to demonstrate that if one considers the spatial categories in terms of which people were identified or identified themselves, these were, more often than not, cities such as Mithila or territorial units such as Janapadas, rather than categories such as Bharatavarsha, even as the latter is mentioned in the Puranas. While this can be illustrated from inscriptional evidence, we can also think of well-known examples from the epics. In the Ramayana, for instance, Sita is often identified and addressed as Vaidehi, that is belonging to Videha, as also Maithili. So she's identified in terms of her natal home. Kausalya's name is also derived from Kosala. And in the Mahabharata, Draupadi is known as Panchali, again drawing on her association with her natal home. Chattopadhyay suggests that these terms give us a sense of a loosely structured territory within which these and other regions or Janapadas were included. This was a territory whose frontiers shifted over time. In any case, it was not visualized as a frozen or a fixed category. Also, Janapadas were internally differentiated, often including towns, rural areas, and forested lands. The next one. The third dimension that Chattopadhyay draws attention to consists of, and I quote, the many meanings of dharma. These include attempts to define universal norms, perhaps best exemplified in the Ashokan inscriptions, through which the ruler attempted to prescribe certain broad practices to ensure social harmony and well-being. At the same time, we find within the Brahmanical tradition a constant preoccupation with Varnashrama dharma. As is well known, These dharmas were visualized as differentiated in varying degrees of detail, including specific social norms that were to be observed by men and women of the four social categories: Brahmanas, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras. Ashrama dharma was even more specific and was ideally restricted to men of the first three social categories. There is also a third strand acknowledged within the Sanskrit normative texts, that is the Dharma Sutras and the Dharma Shastras, recognizing that dharma could vary according to region, village, or family, as well as in terms of other units. The next one. In tentatively connecting the past, present, and future, Chattopadhyay opens up the possibility for what he refers to as transformative dialogue. To quote him, transformative dialogue could imply sharing, borrowing, interpenetration, rejection, as also synthesis. While Chattopadhyay visualizes these dialogues taking place across differentiated spatial units, we can extend the possibility of such dialogues to different social categories as well. As a student of ancient Indian history, I would hesitate to plunge into an analysis of our present predicament and would be even more hesitant to make predictions about the future. What I will try and do instead is to share an ancient and troubling narrative which grapples with issues of difference at a variety of levels. We may not find immediate answers, but hopefully the narrative will open spaces for discussion and for moving beyond platitudes that often seem worn out and weary. We often tend to conflate the notion of the composite with an idea of dialogue or coexistence across religious divides, most obviously between Hinduism and Islam. And yet, when we pause to think about it, there are other equally, if not more crucial divisions in society, and more often than not, they complicate things. As we have seen, Chattopadhyay's discussion alerts us to some of these. These complications, while resisting reduction to simplistic binaries, may provide insights about possibilities of creating space for negotiation. In what follows, we explore several divides and attempts to bridge them across gender, caste, class, and kinship. Hopefully, this will enable us to envisage spaces within our social universe in more complex ways. The next one. The story that I draw on is from the Pali Buddhist tradition, part of the anthology of the Jatakas. As is well known, the Jatakas contain narratives which are supposed to be about the previous births of the Buddha. In these stories, the Bodhisattva takes many forms: animals, birds, trees, and men belonging to a wide range of social and economic categories. In this particular Jataka, the Matanga Jataka, which is number 497 in the present Pali anthology, the Bodhisattva is born as a Chandala. As has been remarked by scholars who have examined the text, this is exceptional rather than typical. The story itself is remarkable for its dramatic twists and turns. It begins with an encounter between Matanga, the Chandala, and Ditta Mangalika, the daughter of a wealthy man, a Sethi. They accidentally see one another when the woman is out in the open on a social visit, and she, on discovering that he is a Chandala, washes her eyes in order to remove the purported pollution and returns home. This turn of events angered those who expected to receive gifts from her on this occasion. They beat up Matanga for having disrupted the proceedings. Matanga, after reflection, decided that he would not rest until he had obtained Ditta Mangalika. He remained outside her home, fasting for 7 days, after which her family brought her out and handed her over to him. As he was weak after fasting for such a long time, she had to carry him back to his residence. Once they reached, Matanga decided that he needed to acquire knowledge in order to be worthy of her and proceeded to do so. In due course, having acquired insight, he returned to a splendid reception and was acknowledged as Mahabrahma. He then touched Dittha Mangalika on the navel with his thumb to ensure the birth of a son and assured her that both she and her son would prosper, and that all those who wished for their blessings would seek the water she needed, she used for washing her feet and for bathing, amongst other things. Dittha Mangalika received vast quantities of wealth as homage, and in due course, a son known as Mandavya Kumar was born to her. As the young boy grew up, he learnt the three Vedas and began offering hospitality to Brahmanas on a regular basis. After some years, Matanga, who had returned to the Himalayas, decided to find out what his son was up to and returned as a Chandala begging for alms. His son brusquely refused any hospitality, even as Matanga attempted to reason with him. Matanga left the scene, but the deities of the city, outraged at what had happened, decided to punish Mandavya Kumara and the Brahmanas by twisting their necks. People reported this to Dittha Mangalika, who realized that Matanga was probably around and would be able to help. She tracked him down and approached him humbly, requesting for a solution. Matanga agreed to provide one and offered his leavings of food for all those who were afflicted. When Mandavya Kumar and the Brahmanas ate these, they were restored, and Matanga Pandit left once more for the Himalayas. Dittha Mangalika advised her son to offer alms only to the deserving and wise, and those who were genuinely so, to distinguish between the learned, those who appeared to be learned, as well as those who were genuinely learned. However, while the Brahmanas recovered, they were exiled from the kingdom and sought refuge elsewhere. The story continues with a conflict between Matanga and another arrogant Brahman named Jati Manta, who is taught a lesson in the course of which Matanga demonstrates his ability to control even the sun by the power of his asceticism. Matanga then went in search of the Brahmanas who had fled earlier and found them in another kingdom. The Brahmanas recognized him and they persuaded the king to kill him. As the royal orders were executed, the kingdom and all its inhabitants were destroyed in a torrent of hot ash rained down by the gods in retribution for what was considered to be a miscarriage of justice. The next one. With this story in mind, let us think through the issue of the composite. It is evident that the narrative foregrounds the differences between the Brahmanical and the Buddhist claims to learning, and by extension to social status. At one level, this is represented as a conflict between exclusivity and inclusivity. The violent end suggests that while exclusivity appears to triumph in the short run, it is inclusivity that is upheld by some kind of divine intervention. In other words, this is not an easy victory. Human and divine powers are brought into play, and the final outcome, even if justified, remains a dismal one. It is useful to remind ourselves about the multiple meanings of dharma that Chattopadhyay alerts us to, and the possibility that there can be conflicts about these. In attempting to resolve such conflicts, the challenge before us remains one of choosing between more or less inclusive or exclusive resolutions. There is yet another strand, one that operates at a lower yet intersecting level within the overarching narrative. This is the story of Matanga and Dittha Mangalika, who are starkly different in terms of gender, class, and caste. Their first encounter is one marked by aversion on Dittha Mangalika's part, and perhaps attraction on the part of Matanga. The resolution, let us note, is messy. Mangalika is given away by her kinfolk in response to Matanga's persistence, and there is a reversal of social hierarchies as she carries him on her back. At the same time, it is their relationship, complicated as it is, that offers glimpses of alternatives. Once they are united, Matanga proceeds to acquire learning and wisdom. And in the sequel, it is evident that both Mangalika and Matanga share values of compassion, even as the former remains within the world and the latter adopts the life of a wandering sage. It is Mangalika, moreover, who works out a resolution to save her son and the Brahmanas, even though it might be a temporary reprieve. It is obvious that this is by no means an ideal resolution of gender differences. Mangalika does not acquire enlightenment or knowledge herself, at least explicitly, even as her understanding and wisdom are evident in her responses in the second part of the narrative. What is also interesting is that both she and Matanga change and evolve in the course of the narrative. Initial responses of attraction and aversion, however misplaced, seem to make way for a greater understanding and respect for one another, even if it may not neatly fit into a conventional understanding of conjugality. If their union represents building bridges across divides of gender, caste, class, and probably beliefs and practices, it is represented as being possible only when both accept the challenge of change and transformation that this entails. In other words, it alerts us to the fact that working towards the composite can and perhaps must involve a willingness to change, to transform, not so much others as ourselves. Also, as we have seen, this operates along several axes. Such transformations would by no means have been easy. The anxieties about Sankara, to which B.D. Chattopadhyay alerts us, are a reminder of the difficulties that this would have posed. But as we have seen, Chattopadhyay also opens up the possibility of transformative dialogues in the course of his discussion. There is a third and final point that I would like to make, and this is about the sites of interaction between people who are different. Here, what is worth noting is the way in which the domestic space is constructed and presented. This is not regarded as a bounded, isolated space, but is instead porous. Mangalika's natal residence is, for instance, open to intervention from outside, and Matanga's hunger strike proves successful. Their marital home, too, is not exclusive, but seems to be both supported by people as well as open to public scrutiny. And in the case of their son, Mandavya Kumara, it is evident that his palatial parental home is ideally accessible to those who are beneficiaries of his hospitality. Further, spaces for dialogue are envisaged within the kinship network between husband and wife, father and son, mother and son. In other words, the domestic space is not envisaged as a simple monolithic patriarchal unit. What is also apparent is the way in which everyday practices of denying, giving, and receiving food become the means of constructing and contesting social relations. Matanga, as we have seen, begs for food from his son. It is the refusal to offer hospitality that triggers off a drastic chain of events. When Mangalika pleads for a remedy, it is his leftover food that Matanga offers, and this proves transformative, even as the Brahmanas resent having to consume it and are punished for it. Thus, the apparently simple quotidian act of sharing food becomes invested with complex social, cultural, and political meaning. Acknowledging the importance of such apparently banal acts that are potentially transformative may yield insights about the possibilities as well as the pitfalls in striving for the composite. It is also worth remembering that narratives such as these would have circulated widely. They were probably part of oral traditions, even as they were collated and compiled within monasteries. Further, they could have been narrated in part or in full, more casually or formally, and possibly in many languages. In terms of narrative structure, it is perhaps significant that the dialogues between Matanga and Mandavya Kumar, father and son, and between Ditha Mangalika and Matanga Kumara, that is mother and son, are in verse. These would have lent themselves to a dramatic rendering as well. While we have no way of knowing how audiences may have responded to such performances, the potentially widespread dissemination of such narratives would have probably created space for debate and discussion. To conclude, if this relatively small but complex narrative holds any lessons from the past for the future, it is probably the following. First, neither the exclusive nor the composite are likely to be achieved automatically. They require an effort to be both attained and maintained. Second, if we are invested in the composite, it requires that we be willing to accept change in ourselves as well as others against something that may not always be simple or easy. And third, the composite, like much else, defies compartmentalization into public and private domains. It is integral to both. Also, it is worth keeping in mind that creating, preserving, and transmitting narratives that remind us about the complexity of the composite are one way of ensuring that diversity survives, even as we may require far more active interventions in future. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mom, for that wonderful narrative, or rather bringing out of the ancient, and at the same time, inclusiveness and composite, whether they are, how they have to be seen. And it is also important here, what we thought is, in the ancient, up to almost 9th century, there was no problem with Muslims or no Muslims at all. So therefore, invoking Muslim alone is the composite culture and all appear to be a bit too much of over simplification. That is what the ancient story appears to have brought out. Thanks a lot, Mom, for this nice old story. Now, Professor Lal. Vinay Lal is a writer, blogger, cultural critic, and professor of history and Asian American studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. He earned his PhD with distinction from the University of Chicago in 1992. After undergraduate and master's degree in literature and philosophy from Johns Hopkins University. He writes widely on Indian history, historiography, the Indian diaspora, colonialism, the architecture of nonviolence, Gandhi, American politics, contemporary culture, and the global politics of knowledge systems. His 20-some books, such as the 2-volume Oxford Anthology of the Modern City, etc., are highly popular, especially academically. He also edited and co-edited a few books. His scholarly work has been translated into Hindi, Urdu, Kannada, French, German, Spanish, Finnish, Korean, and Persian. And his shorter essays and popular writings have been translated into some 40 languages, including Portuguese, Estonian, Ukrainian, Slovak, Russian, Bosnian, Polish, Albanian, Greek, Indonesian, and Thai. 3 of his forthcoming books include The Artist and Insurgency, The Art of the Freedom Struggle in India, and the 2-volume of his collected papers on Gandhi. A book on the history of colonial India told through stories. A study of internet Hinduism, etc., are his works in progress. He also has the distinction of being listed among the 101 most dangerous professors in America in David Horowitz's book. He blogs at vinaylal.wordpress.com and at abplive.in. His academic YouTube channel at youtube.com/user/Dilli has nearly 2.5 million views. In fact, I myself am a very frequent visitor of this academic channel. The podium is yours, sir, Professor Lal, the dangerous professor, to show the red placard for the rogue rugby cultural hawks. To you, sir.
Thank you very much for the generous introduction and for the invitation. My thanks to everyone in the Anekdhara team. Let me say that that Professor Roy has displayed remarkable discipline, and I'm not sure I will be able to emulate the brevity with which she has been able to give forth a very sustained and rigorous argument. She has also at the same time laid the groundwork in some respects for what I want to say, in particular with respect to the question of the quotidian and the question of hospitality, which I will come to. Let me begin with two stories. The first is a story drawn from somewhere other than India. It's a story that I read in a book by Mark Mazover, who's a historian at Columbia, and it's an extraordinary book on a city, a biography of a city, Salonika, also known as Thessalonica in the Greek world. Now, this is a city which has had a very cosmopolitan past. On one single street, literally yards from each other, you could see at one point a mosque, a Greek Orthodox church, a Syrian Orthodox church, a mosque, and various other religious establishments. In the early 1940s, the Nazis came to Salonika. And the first thing the Nazi commander asked when he arrived with the troops was, where is the ghetto? Where is the Jewish ghetto? Because Salonika had also a Jewish population, and on that same street where you found all these religious establishments, there was a synagogue as well. And he was told, much to his astonishment, there is no ghetto in Salonika. And so he writes back to Berlin, to the headquarters in Berlin, saying these people are uncivilized. They have not been properly tutored because they don't understand that a Jewish person belongs only in a ghetto and nowhere else. Now, this is in part the story of empires. I'm not nostalgic about empires by any stretch of the imagination, but I think empires, historians will often argue, were in many ways far more cosmopolitan and ecumenical than the nation state. This is really a parable also about the problem of the nation state, because the kind of hospitality that an empire could offer is something that nation states, it seems to me, are incapable of doing so. The nation state is the modular form in which the political community survives today. And this is part of what I want to really argue, is that the problem of India today is partly the problem of the nation state. It is not only the problem of India, it is a problem everywhere in the world. Because I believe that the nation state is a particular form of political community, which by definition is actually inhospitable. The second story is drawn from Rabindranath Tagore. In the early 1920s, he visited China and he gave a number of lectures there. And those lectures, which were given and delivered in English, have been collected together in the English writings of Rabindranath Tagore. There are a number of different collections of that, but there's a beautiful multi-volume edition of that by Sahitya Akademi, the English writings. And one of these lectures, he describes to the audience what happened when the Northwest frontier was bombed. by air from the British. This is, of course, pre-1947. So this is the time when India was undivided. And this is when the Masouds, which is one group, one Pathan group really, was being pacified from the air by the British. One of these fighter aircrafts that had actually bombed the villages there, that very same aircraft had to make an emergency landing in the middle of the village. And the two airmen tried to bail out of, so when the plane lands, it's going to blow up, of course, in flames and momentarily. And so they quickly are trying to exit from the burning wreckage. And they are surrounded by the same villagers who had been bombed just moments ago by these two airmen. But these two airmen are gingerly rescued, taken out of the burning aircraft, and they're taken to a nearby cave where they are fed and nursed back to health before being sent back to the border so they can go back into British India. According to a Masood, Tagore explains to his audience, because the audience, of course, was wondering, what is this about? I mean, and this seems very odd that the very same people who have been just bombed are now offering this kind of hospitality. And so Tagore says in his lecture, and I quote here, according to a Masood, hospitality is a quality by which he is known as a man, and therefore he cannot afford to miss his opportunity, even when dealing with someone who can be systematically relentless in enmity. From the practical point of view, the Masood pays for this very dearly, as we must always pay for that which we hold most valuable. It is the mission of civilization to set for us the right standard of valuation. The Masood may have many faults for which he should be held accountable, but that which has imparted for him more value to hospitality than to revenge may not be called progress, but is certainly civilization. End quote. Now, we're here to talk about composite culture. There are a great many words, the composite culture of India, there are a great many words that we can think about, which, as Wittgenstein would have said, bear a family resemblance. When we're thinking about composite culture, we can also think about plurality, we can think about diversity, we can think about what is often called the syncretic culture, particularly syncretic culture of the Indo-Islamic cultural synthesis, as it were, that was created in India. Right? And I think it is important to understand how we don't have the luxury here of being able to distinguish between all of these terms, but it's very important, it seems to me, to be able to understand how what we are calling the composite culture, or the kind of plurality we have had in India, differs from notions of diversity, which are now being universalized around the world, much like the whole idea of multiculturalism. In the United States and in much of the West, I would argue, this recourse to diversity and multiculturalism should be understood as a model where we think of how it filters from top down. Whereas in India, it seems to me there was always diversity on the ground in various ways. So we have to think of it ground up. Right? When we're thinking of composite culture in particular, this very idea, as that is to say, as a historical idea, actually has a certain genealogy. One could always say that it was there in practice, but as often as the case, the practice precedes the theory, so to speak. And really, when we use the phrase itself, what we're really thinking about is the contributions of a number of different people and texts in the early 20th century or first half of the 20th century. For example, a work by Tara Chand called The Influence of Islam on Indian Culture, a work by Kishti Mohan Sen called Hindu Musalmane Jukto Shadna, which is roughly you can translate as a joint meditation on the Hindu and the Musalman or the Muslim. And for example, the report, a very extraordinary report actually, published by a Congress committee appointed to inquire into the Kanpur riots, in 1931, which vastly exceeded the brief that had been given to the committee, when being asked to inquire into the circumstances that had led to the riot, it decided to offer a huge resume of the whole past of Hindu-Muslim relations in India. And this is where, in texts like these, the ideas of composite culture was first really, in a way, theorized by historians and by other public figures. Now, it is the case, and I think that this was mentioned by Gagarin in his introduction, that most discussions of composite culture revolve really around Hindu-Muslim relations, or what we might call the Indo-Islamic synthesis, or more broadly, Hindu-Muslim syncretism, because Indo-Islamic cultural synthesis and what is called the Ganga-Jamuna Tehzeeb, this of course refers to, North India, particularly the Doab. But let's not forget, for example, and I can't really mention this or discuss this in detail, but let's not forget that many of the courts, the Muslim courts in the Deccan, were actually very cosmopolitan. They had, for example, very interesting links with Persia, right? I mean, we often think, when we think of the grand Muslim culture, we are thinking of the Mughals court, but the Deccani courts are no less interesting in their own way. But whichever set of courts we look at, it is clearly the case that it is really relations between Hindu and Muslims that most people are thinking of when they're thinking of the composite culture of India, more particularly because the adherents of these two faiths constitute the majority, the preponderant majority, or over 90% of the population of India. And in the first instance, I think we should certainly attempt to broaden out the discussion beyond Hindu-Muslim relations, as indeed Professor Roy has already done when she has gone to the Jataka, corpus. We can't forget, of course, that much of North India was Buddhist before it was Hindu. I say this with the awareness that no one described himself or herself as a Hindu in ancient India, or indeed in nearly all of the history of pre-colonial India. They were Vaishnavas, they were Shaivites, they were Shaktos, Tantrics, Ajivikas or Charvakas, Jains, Buddhists, later on Kabirpanthis, Nanakpanthis, the adherents of the cult of Gorakhnath, and others far too numerous to mention. For instance, some of the groups that are discussed in Shashi Bhushan Dasgupta's wonderful book, very old but wonderful book called Obscure Religious Cults as Background of Bengali Literature from 1946, or the kinds of groups that are discussed in Eliade's book Yoga, Immortality, and Freedom, which also include groups such as the Bauls, the ecstatic mystic minstrels of West Bengal and now rural Bangladesh, whose songs and music have now been recognized by UNESCO as part of the intangible heritage of India. Right? The point here is simply this, that not all of these groups, in fact, the groups that Shashi Bhushan Dasgupta discusses, are communities, groups that in many ways disavowed bookish learning altogether. So when we're thinking of the composite culture of India, we should think not simply of those people who are bookish, but we should also think of those who renounced books, writing. We should think of the Vedic and the Avedic, and so on, with the recognition that Hinduism is, of course, the corporate category through which we think about many of the things in the past. Now, the composite culture of India was never only a case of considering Hindu-Muslim relations. Consider, for example, the case, very briefly, of the Parsis and the Jews. Right? Their numbers, of course, I recognize, were very small. And I recognize this in particular as an argument now, because I think one should be able to anticipate the objection that, well, their numbers were so minuscule that they never really posed a threat. For those who would like to posit the idea that, well, the whole idea of Hindu tolerance, as it was known, right, that word hasn't come up in the discussion yet, but the whole idea of Hindu tolerance, that this is a fiction, as has sometimes been argued. And so therefore, when you refer to, let's say, the Jews and the Parsis, they'll say that, well, their numbers are really so small. I'll get to that in just a moment. Let us also recall that even though the numbers of the Jews were very small, even in that minuscule number, you actually had very distinct communities. So you had the Cochin Jews, you had the Baghdadi Jews, you had the Bene Israel, right? And with regard to the question of their numbers being very small, I want to just remind everybody, and this is a terrain I know quite well as a student of the Indian diaspora for a long time, is that, when there were fewer than 1,000 Indians in the United States, and here I'm talking about the early 1900s, really early 1900s, yeah. There was a racial riot that took place in Western Washington in Bellingham against the Hindus, as they were called. And by the way, the Sikhs were included in the Hindus because that was the only language that white America knew at that time. There was no separate classification. At that time, the newspapers were full of headlines such as "Hindu hordes attack America," literally. Right? So it's not simply a question of numbers. I think it is a question here of how one thinks about the other. So what can we say here about the Jews of India? Jews acculturated and not simply assimilated into Indian society. They retained their very distinct characteristics, their forms and modes of worship, and so on. Here is the verdict of one scholar. Quote, "Jews navigated the eddies and shoals of Indian culture very well. They never experienced anti-Semitism or discrimination at Indian hands. They contributed to Indian civilization in a variety of secular arts and medicine and commerce, cinema, politics, agriculture, and the military. Indian Jews lived as all Jews should have been allowed to live." And here, let me pause. And of course, the minute you read this, you know that this is being written by someone who is writing with the awareness of the long history of anti-Semitism in nearly every other part of the world, and especially in Europe and the United States. And this scholar continues. So he says, Indian Jews lived as all Jews should have been allowed to live, free, proud, observant, creative, and prosperous, self-realized, full contributors to the community, end quote. Now, you might think to yourself that a scholar who's writing this is someone who's evidently proud of Indian culture, perhaps a Hindu nationalist. Well, this is an American Jewish scholar, Nathan Katz, who wrote a book called "Who Are the Jews of India?" published by University of California Press in 2000. And of course, when he's speaking about their contribution, one can think, for example, of the wonderful poet Nizam Ezekiel. One can think of the fact that so many institutions having to do with social reform in Bombay and Pune are named after the Sassoon family, because the Sassoon family is the family that contributed to these orphanages, to these hospitals, and so on. And one could make much the same argument apropos of the Parsis. Their contributions are far too numerous for me to be able to enumerate, of course, and quite unnecessary to do so at this particular juncture. Apart from their critical importance in the early years of the Indian National Congress, in the making of Bombay itself, and so on. Now, when we get to the question of colonial and modern India, let me begin. I'm going to take up two or three. So unlike Professor Roy, whose strategy here has been quite different, and mine is complementary in a way, that she's looked at one sort of study in particular in some detail, I'm simply here giving you a different kind of sweep, a different way, a different set of ways to enter into this kind of discussion that we are having about the nature of our composite culture. And of course, in my closing remarks, I will move to the whole question of what are the perils that face India today when we think about this composite culture. Some years ago, Harjot Oberoi wrote what in my judgment at least, other historians may naturally take a different view, but we all rest upon the work of fellow scholars as well in various ways. He wrote what, in my judgment, is really an extraordinary book. It's a book called The Construction of Religious Boundaries, Culture, Identity, and Diversity in the Sikh Tradition. And it's a book for which he got into enormous trouble with the Sikh community. Because one of the things that he was trying to establish there is, of course, a very contentious scholarship on this question since then as well. And this question, of course, had been at the heart of many of the discussions in the Sikh tradition. But one of the things that he's trying to establish is that there never really was any kind of boundary as such between the Sikhs and the Hindus. And there were colonial authors who themselves recognized this very much. For example, if you look at Ibbotson, who in his report on the census of the Punjab in 1881 had this to say. But on the borderlands, he writes, where these great faiths meet, writing about Sikhism and Hinduism, and especially among the ignorant peasantry, whose creed, by whatever name it may be known, is seldom more than a superstition and a ritual, the various observances and beliefs which distinguish the followers of the several faiths in their purity are so strangely blended and intermingled that it is often impossible to say that one prevails rather than other, or to decide in what category the people shall be classed, right? And I want to emphasize, Ibbotson's description of the people who refuse to segregate these faiths, so to speak, as the ignorant, right? And this is, of course, another way of hearkening to the quotidian, that in everyday life and in everyday cultural practices, it was often impossible to distinguish, not only between Sikhism and Hinduism, but Hinduism and Islam, as we shall see, right? And this is, so the bulk of what Harjot Singh Roy is going to argue here is to suggest how we should think about Sikhism and Hinduism. How is it that a border, a boundary came between the two? What was the role of the Singh Sabha, for example, in the late 19th century? Their discomfort with the idea of multiplicity within the Sikh identity, because if I may put it this way, that when these boundaries begin to close, right, as they are closing in India today, they also close not simply between faiths, but within each faith. Within each faith, these boundaries begin to close. And that's what he's trying to demonstrate here, that first, the ideas of multiplicity within the Sikh faith are going to gradually be eviscerated. And his book is an extraordinary demonstration of how really that comes to happen. Now, there is another way in which we can begin to understand this, and I understand that some people may or may not go along with this. I mean, for example, Romila Thapar and many others have spoken about, with reference to Hindu nationalism of the last 2-3 decades, especially, not simply, by the way, since 2014, but long before that, because let's not forget that the destruction of the Babri Masjid took place in 1992, on 6th December 1992. That's long before the present regime came into power, right? And people like her and some others have been arguing about what they have called the Semitization of Hinduism, right? We can think of another term as well, and that term that I would want to use, because this is a term which, it seems to me, actually takes us more precisely to the nature of the problem, and that is the particular way in which every religion in the world, beginning in the early 19th century, the process goes back to the early 19th century, began to fashion itself in the shape of Protestant Christianity. Protestant Christianity in particular, right? And this holds true of Islam, it holds true of Hinduism, it holds true of Buddhism, right? And this is, of course, one of the templates in which we have to really think of somebody like Kumkum Roy. Now, just to give you one or two more examples, and then I'll quickly draw to a conclusion, and I can elaborate upon these examples at much greater detail if anyone has any interest and if there's time in the Q&A. So, like some other people who write on colonial India and modern India, I've long been interested in the whole problem of Gujarat. And in particular, when the incident took place at Godhra, my interest was really piqued, and I began to look at what are called the imperial gazetteers. So one of the many projects of the colonial state, what I have elsewhere described as the epistemological imperatives of the colonial state, one of those projects was to produce this massive series of what are called the imperial gazetteers. And if you look at the imperial gazetteers series and you look at the 2 volumes of the Bombay Presidency, it makes for remarkable reading, really remarkable reading. Because if I had to put it in a nutshell, the colonial ethnographers went looking for difference. They went looking to differentiate very clearly between the Hindus and between the Muslims. And in every volume of this series, not simply the volumes having to do with the Bombay Presidency, they found that they were running into enormous difficulties in doing so. Because they would find, for example, Muslim cultivators in Ratlam worshipping Sitala and following the Hindu customs in their marriages. They talk about the mayors, about which, of course, Shal Mairam and others have written in more recent decades, of Alwar and Bharatpur, right? But to get to the point, it is really Gujarat where they found the greatest degree of what we might simply call mixing. Gujarat in particular. Right? And of course, one has to then attempt to understand what is the relationship of all of that to what has transpired in Gujarat in recent years. So Gujarat, for example, they found has more than its fair share of non-Sunni Muslims. Many of them were deemed inauthentic Muslims already by the Orthodox, who read neither the Quran nor offered daily prayers, and instead kept the pictures of Swaminarayan in their houses and worshipped them. These same gazetteers relate to us the story of the Hussaini Brahmins. Just think of the phrase, Hussaini Brahmins, who describe themselves as followers of the Atharva Veda, but derived their name from Imam Hussain, the grandson of the Prophet. Though not converts to Islam, they had adopted those Islamic beliefs which were more easily reconcilable with Hinduism, and so on. Right? So I think that the gist of what I'm trying to suggest here should be very clear. And I have a long discussion, which I will omit here and simply get to my concluding remarks, because I had a discussion here of Ghazi Mian, about which one of India's finest historians, Shahid Amin, has written a wonderful book published a few years ago. And I had some remarks, of course, about the Ganga Jamuna Tehzeeb as well. But here I want to really talk about, in the concluding 5 minutes, let's say, about what we might call the perils of the kind of homogenization that is taking place today. I mean, many commentators have argued, I don't think that it is incorrect to argue that way at all. Many commentators have argued, looking at the present trends, that there seems to be a tendency to want to establish something like a Hindu Rashtra in India today, right? Now, I won't really comment per se on that. What I do want to comment on is to suggest where we can see some of the problems propping up. What are the forms of homogenization that are taking place in India, and how do they pose a particular problem for those who stand by the idea that there has been in India a composite culture? We may not be the only. I remember I started with a story from Salonika. We may not be the only civilization in the world. Perhaps we have that conceit that we think we are the only or the greatest civilization to have this composite culture. It is, again, I think, unnecessary to entertain that thought. But what is certainly very clear is that the kind of composite culture that we have had, it seems to me, is in peril today. For example, think about the whole endeavor to de-Arabicize and de-Persianize our languages. Hindi, And there have been certainly either pronouncements or actions by the government which certainly suggest this kind of trend. Consider, for example, the various attempts, really blatantly open attempts to falsify the past, right? I mean, Professor Roy would be able to weigh in on this. I mean, I visited the National Museum at Janpat just before the coronavirus pandemic struck, and I was astonished by something there. I was looking at the whole exhibit, which had to do with Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, right? And of course, this doesn't involve Muslims or this or that, really. What it involves is colonial officials, because we have heard the story of how they came upon this. What is really interesting there is that in the exhibit there, the colonial state has completely disappeared. It's just disappeared, right? I mean, and so, this may not really have a bearing on the composite culture as such. It is simply an illustration of what I'm arguing about attempts to falsify the past, right? What happens to, for example, Mughal art in India? How is it going to be displayed? I certainly, and I don't believe these are only rumors, I have certainly seen references to attempts to try to eviscerate some of this from our museums. My particular concern is the textbook. I have written very extensively on what I call the culture of the textbook. I think the textbook is a peril to thinking everywhere in the world. And there are reasons why we should not use textbook, because what is a textbook? And why is it that the present government, and again, let us be very clear, it's not only the present government that has been tinkering with textbooks. Some of these problems go back several decades. It's just that now they have taken on a new life. They have become considerably aggravated in various ways, right? Why is a textbook so critically important to the nation state? It is as critically important to the nation state as the national symbol, as a national flag, as a national anthem, as a national language. We don't have a national language. I'll come to that in a moment, right? But most countries do. The vast majority of countries in the world do. And everywhere, what the textbook does is it helps to produce not simply a homogenized history, it helps to produce a proper subject of a proper nation state. And here I'm using the word proper, of course, ironically. That is, to someone who can be easily a subject who can become docile, obedient, much as Immanuel Kant had described when he described what the function of schooling was, right? Notwithstanding all the great liberal ideas we have about schooling, what exactly it is that schooling really does, how it makes us obedient, and in this case, obedient to the nation state. Now, we do not have a national language, and in my view, not widely shared, perhaps, and certainly not shared by anyone in the present administration of India. We do not have a national language, and that is for the better, I think. It is certainly for the better, right? What is it that Amit Shah said on 14 September 2019, of course, in a tweet? That's the only way the government of India communicates, is through tweets. Quote, India is a country of different languages, and every language has its own importance, but it is very important to have a language which should become the identity of India in the world. If one language can unite the country today, it is a widely spoken Hindi language, end quote. And let us keep in mind what the Indian Constitution says, Article 343, that the official language of the Union shall be Hindi in the Devanagari script, official language, not national language. And then Articles 346 and Articles 347, as well as the Official Languages Act, also mention English as the other official language in which the business of the union government and the parliament can be conducted. Every state can, of course, have its own official language in addition, right? But we do not have a national language, and we should consider why it is that this government is so keen on trying to push for one. Right? Now, last set of comments. There is a familiar language in which all of this is often discussed. For example, unity in diversity. It may be a cliche. It certainly is a cliche, but it is not going to go away anytime soon. Can we, however, speak of this issue in a different language? Because I think it is imperative that we learn to live with difference. What I called hospitality, going back to my story from Tagore, and the idea of being hospitable, are ways to think through this. How can we be hospitable to others and host the difference of the other within ourselves? Hosting, so to speak, the otherness of the other within ourselves. There is now a large and still growing literature on the question of religion and secularism, which is one avenue into this. But I would like to end here with an insight from Mohandas Gandhi. With regards to the argument that I'm presently advancing, Gandhi is important in the same way that Ghaffar Khan is important with regards to this argument, namely that just as Gandhi derived his secularism from being a devout Hindu in his own fashion, Ghaffar Khan derived his secularism from being a devout Muslim. What Gandhi also said is this: if you are a Hindu and you believe in the power of prayer, then pray not that the Muslim, Christian, or Buddhist should become a Hindu, but rather that the Muslim should become a better Muslim, a Christian a better Christian, a Buddhist a better Buddhist. Similarly, if you are a devout Muslim, pray not that the Hindus, Christians, Jains, Buddhists, and others should become Muslims, but rather that Hindus should become better Hindus, Christians, better Christians, and so on. And likewise, of course, that is how Jains and Buddhists and adherents of all other faiths should pray. This insight can, I think, be the beginning for thinking of ways in which we can retain and strengthen the composite culture for which India is justly famous and which today faces greater peril than it ever has in the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lal, for that really great and insightful presentation or exposition. The jugalbandi between two professors is really nice and heartwarming with that caution or rather note. Composite culture, for which India is really and uniquely and quintessentially famous, is in greater peril in the present days than any other time in the past history. Both you professors really brought the 5,000 years of Indian tolerance or composite culture or inclusive, exclusive conflict in a crucible like Holy Grail. Really very nice. Now there are a lot of questions in queue. Both of you can take, unless the questionnaire specifically mentions any name, depending upon both of you. The first one is, the din going on the majoritarian Hindu regime, is it not really minoritarian, as less than 5 or 6% Hindus keep the 95% Hindus in their stranglehold, invoking Hindu bogi? Where is composite culture here? This is the question. Either one of you can take up, or both of you can take up individually, one after the other.
I was wondering whether it may not be a good idea to take a few questions together and then respond. That might be useful. So if maybe 3 or 4 questions or whatever together might be a useful way of going about it.
Yeah, this is important for both of you should respond to this, I think. The din going on, the majoritarian Hindu regime, is it not really minoritarian, as less than 5 or 6% Hindus keep the 95% Hindus in their stranglehold, invoking Hindu bogi? Where is composite culture here?
Yeah. Kumkum, why don't you go ahead first?
Okay. I was just wondering, I think the way in which this question has been posed, it kind of forecloses certain kinds of answers and expects a certain kind of response. We probably need to think about why what we are calling 95% of the Hindus are not responding in ways in which we would expect them to respond. It's not sufficient for us to think about this as them being mindlessly succumbing to the 5%. There is something more at work, which I think we need to consider and explore. It's probably much more important for Professor Lal with his understanding of the contemporary world to perhaps respond to it. But I think it's we shouldn't dismiss the fact of what the 95% are accepting or acquiescing in. If they are accepting or acquiescing in it, we need to find ways of addressing that and thinking through that rather than dismissing it as coming from the pressure of the 5%. That would be my response.
So let me just add something to that. I agree with what Professor Roy has said. Let me just try to get into this in a slightly different way. See, for example, if you, let's say you take the instance of what happened in Nazi Germany. Now, you see, what happened in Nazi Germany did not happen merely on account of the actions of some leaders called Hitler and Himmler and Göring and so on, okay? It is the problem of the complicity of a vast number of Germans. One of the things that scholarship, for example, has dwelled on is the role of people called bystanders, witnesses. Let us be very clear that what is transpiring in India today is not simply a consequence of the action of the state and some functionaries of the state. The problem is the Hindu middle class, large segments of which have entirely bought into the kinds of narratives that have become current with the present administration. One regrets to say that so forcefully, but that is very much the case. Everything suggests that very clearly, right? So I think that this is not simply a question of, you know, a small minority of Hindus claiming to speak and sending their, you know, stormtroopers either on the streets or on social media. And incidentally, all over the world, people who work on social media, all over the world, it is recognized that nowhere are the stormtroopers of social media so vicious as they are in India, unfortunately. The minute someone says anything which sounds, quote, even remotely liberal, the packs just go after them on social media, right? So I believe that this is, we should not minimize what is happening. At the same time, of course, given what I have spent 35 minutes saying, I do believe that we have the resources within our civilization, if we think about what is transpiring, to be able to come up with some kind of resistance to what is going on.
Mom, I think you have asked 2-3 questions can be read one so that you can respond. The 2 questions I'd like to read out. One is, I don't know, this may be more academic. Isn't constitution, no. How one does distinguish between composite culture and multiculturalism? How could the Indian society as it has evolved be characterized today? This is one question. The second question is, isn't constitution the real energizing drink that will strengthen the composite culture rather than the inequalitarian Hinduism or any religion for that matter? In fact, the third question also may be related. Rahul Gandhi's comment that India is a union of states based on the preamble of the constitution has stirred a hornet's nest. Historically, what has been the concept of India over the ages, and how do these concepts stand vis-a-vis the modern concept of nation? These three can be taken up together by you. First one is distinguish between composite culture and multiculturalism. Second one is constitution energizing bring. Third one is Rahul Gandhi's comment.
Fine, I'll just try and take these on, address them to some extent, maybe not sufficiently, but we can always move on from there. I think, again, just going back to this small, but I think very interesting and thought-provoking work of B.D. Chattopadhyay that I was referring to, he traces, amongst other things, the way in which you have this notion of composite culture coming up. And composite culture is the category which we find being used much more within India than the notion of multiculturalism. So perhaps we need to keep that distinction in mind. And one of the arguments that B.D. Chattopadhyay makes is that you can see that the idea of composite culture is one that is in the making. It is coming up in response to certain kind of colonial policies and colonial narratives. It's not something that was ever achieved in the past. And that, I think, is something we probably need to keep in mind, even as we can see that there are examples of dialogues, discussions, etc. But a composite culture that recognizes all the participants as genuinely equal with a level playing ground is something that we have not had in the past. And perhaps that is something useful to recognize, even as we recognize that working towards a composite culture based on respect and understanding is something that we should work towards. So I think that is something that is important to keep in mind. Coming to the question about the Constitution, I think one would have to look at what is happening around us constantly. And on the one hand, while we do have the Constitution, and our Constitution is certainly a document that is important, valid, and a document that we need to safeguard, it's also important for us to recognize that what we have and the situation in which we are today is one where democratization is an ongoing process. It's not something that is where we can claim that we have achieved a certain kind of democratization. And I think, for instance, you have Baba Saheb's famous statement, and there are several others who have talked about it, the fact that you do have some kind of democracy in terms of the political right to vote, but social and economic notions of democracy, there is a long, long way that we have to go towards achieving those. So I think that is something to keep in mind while we talk about the Constitution. And while I think that we will always keep on taking recourse to legal mechanisms of redress, and those are very important and crucial. They are significant for all of us in whatever areas we engage with. At the same time, to also recognize that we can and need to intervene on an everyday basis. Everyday practices in terms of what we've been talking about, hospitality and several other practices, are absolutely important for us to try and work out towards a composite culture based on understanding. So to leave everything to the Constitution is not something which is going to work. We need to also think about ways in which we can transform our everyday worlds around us and do it on a systematic basis, not on a one-off basis, but on something that needs to be engaged in every day. As far as the comment made by Rahul Gandhi is concerned, and again, I think there I will just allude briefly to what Chattopadhyay argues for in the concept of Bharatvarsha. One of the points that he makes, and this is something that I mentioned in passing, is that if you look at the way in which the entity of Bharatvarsha was visualized in the past, and if we go back to the Puranic tradition, we can see that it is visualized as being differentiated. And he draws on several texts that I did not bring into this discussion, but he points out that if you look at texts like the Natya Shastra, or you look at texts like the Kama Sutra and several other texts, you can see that they are functioning with a notion of differentiation within what we today recognize as Bharatvarsha, or what is today thought to be Bharatvarsha. And some of it is in terms of identifying the other regions within the subcontinent as being relatively inferior or superior in terms of different kinds of linguistic practices, cultural practices, etc. And one can think of several examples. There's also one little example that I would like to cite, and this is from a very famous inscription. This is the Hathigumpha inscription of Kharavela, who was one of the earliest rulers we know of from what is today Odisha, Kalinga, that region. And Kharavela lists, like many other rulers, he lists his achievements in his inscription. And amongst that, what is interesting is that he, being the ruler of this particular region, claims to have conquered Bharatvarsha, as well as he claims to have defeated the Satavahanas and defeated the rulers of the Tamil region. So obviously, if we look at this inscription coming from the early historic period, he is working with a sense of territory where there is a notion of Bharatvarsha, but it does not include areas in the Deccan or further south. And he himself from Kalinga thinks of Bharatvarsha as being a different unit. So you have those differences that we need to keep in mind. So we can look at it in terms of something, again, that is in the making rather than something that is crystallized. And then the question comes, which I think Professor Lal has flagged very eloquently and very usefully, about what kind of role do we envisage for the nation state? Is the nation state something that is permanent, constant? Is it something that we visualize in different ways? And what are the implications of those different visualizations? But I think a long-term historical perspective is useful on these questions. Thank you.
Yes, sir, Professor Lal, kindly.
You want me to speak to the same questions, or
yes, Professor.
Okay, right, because there are a great many other questions as well. So
yeah, great many other questions. So if you would like to go to the next question, I think we can move.
Yeah, because I mean, I don't mind speaking to that, but there are lots of other questions.
Yeah, there are lots of other questions without any doubt.
Yes, you know, right.
This is, of course, some is Professor Roy, there are a lot of compliments somebody sent. Then can you please elaborate on how different kings try to bring different elites together without major conflicts? Of course, these two historical thing, but
yes, I mean, I don't know exactly how one would. I mean, this would require a very long, because, you know, for example, you could think about what was done. Let's say take the Mughal court.
Yeah,
I mean, you know, the Mughal court, there's so much been work done on the kind of elites that were present. We know, for example, that even during the time of Aurangzeb, there were a large number of Hindu notables. You know, there's recent work on Dara Shikoh, which shows the presence of a large number of Hindu and Jain scholars, not just during the time of Akbar, but other Mughal emperors, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, for example, right? So I think that this is a subject for a very long discussion, but I mean, I've already given a few hints there. So, you know, perhaps we should think of maybe some other questions here that we could try to address. I'm looking here actually at the questions that have been posed here. So there's a question here which says, could you comment on the contribution of Sufi saints towards the growth of a composite culture in India? This is, of course, an important question. I can certainly address it. There is a very large literature on this. I deliberately kind of kept out the whole Bhakti Sufi tradition out of this because large, it seems to me that, and I think Professor Roy would probably agree, that a large part of our energy when we think about composite cultures and all of that, it has really gone into thinking about the place of you know, the sants, the great Bhakti poets and the Sufis, and their role, in the case of the Sufis, their role in the transmission of Islam. It also has to do with long-standing controversies about how Islam spread in India, because there's a school of thought which had always favored what you might call the sword of Islam thesis. And then there are others who have persistently and cogently argued that, well, it was the It was the example of Sufi teachers. Let me answer this in a way, through a very different way, okay? Because I think it will, something I alluded to in my remarks, and I said I won't be able to discuss it right now. So Shahid Amin wrote a book published just a few years ago, and it is on Ghazi Mia. So Ghazi Mia is the alleged nephew of Muhammad of Ghazni, and is said to have accompanied the conqueror on his numerous raids into India. We can't say with absolute certainty. That is partly what Shahid Amin is exploring, that there is a whole kind of legend around this. And his story is extraordinarily instructive, I think, in trying to understand this whole question of a composite culture, because there is a dargah now in Barak, in Uttar Pradesh, close to the border with Nepal. And this dargah attracts millions of people, okay? Now, what is extraordinary is this. I think many people who are listening in will agree with me that if you wanted to mention 2 or 3 names which are likely to set a Hindu person who takes pride in Hindu culture and believes himself or herself to be Hindu nationalist, and who nurses some grievances about what happened to the Hindus in the past, if you want to mention 2, 3 names that are likely to set the person on fire, mention Muhammad of Ghazni. He's on the top of the list. Then there are people like Muhammad of Ghor or Aurangzeb and so on, Babur, right? Muhammad of Ghazni is definitely the person who, because the whole story about his destruction of Somnath and so on, and Romila Thapar has written a whole book on how to think about Somnath. But why is this story so interesting? Because his nephew takes part. That's the legend tells us, right? Takes part, and yet he is venerated by many Hindus. It doesn't stand to reason at all. Maybe this is what the colonial officials thought, that the Hindu is always irrational, right? No, I think there's a far more interesting story which Shahid Amin tells, because the same nephew, Ghazi Mia, is also believed in all these legends to have been the protector of cows. The protector of cows. And remember what English colonial officials often used to say. They used to say that it's a very easy way to distinguish the Hindu from the Muslim. The Muslim loves to eat the cow. The Hindu loves to worship the cow. And that's all we need to know. Literally, that's all we need to know. That just tells us how different these 2 communities are. Right? Now, Ghazi Mia is a Muslim warrior, and he's a protector of cows. And this is, I think, what is really so extraordinarily interesting about our country, about India. But you see, Shahid, being a very, not simply savvy and very good historian, but an insightful person, is very clear that we cannot simply take this as an instance of Hindu-Muslim syncretism or the composite culture of India. It is that, but let us remember, and he reminds us, that it is also a story where you have to view the relationship as agonistic. That is, that there is conflict. This is part of the story. They go hand in hand, right? So when people talk about a composite culture, they are not necessarily constructing some idyllic world, which is what they're often accused of. Some may be doing that, but there has to be awareness of this agonistic comparative relationship, competing interests. It's not only competing interests in the narrow sense, for example, in which nationalism was described by the Cambridge School as simply a parable about competing interests, but that is part of the story, and there is conflict. But it is in the quotidian, in the everyday, that you see how this was actually managed to create a kind of cultural synthesis, which I think is very distinct, frankly. Because you see, Salonika is a story of one city. Here we're talking of an entire culture. And I think the only other place in the world where this may have been true, particularly with regards to Islam and another religion, is Moorish Spain for a period of time. Although there, let us not forget that you were still dealing with Semitic faiths. They were all Semitic faiths. Here you're dealing with Islam and a faith which, as in the parable of the English colonial official, is radically different, right? Yeah. So this is how I would I'm really addressing that question in a different way, because this is where the dargah, what are the Sufi saints? They have their dargahs, right? And there is a dargah. This man is like a Sufi saint, Ghazi Mian, with a very large following, down to the present day, by the way. You're muted. I can't hear you. You have to unmute.
Yeah. The next question is also because you have mentioned this topic. Hospitality is the problem of every nation state. That is what you have mentioned. Maybe
Yes.
true, but in Hindu India, isn't the problem acute and chronic within the Hindu castes themselves, where lower caste Hindu genocide is a daily affair? If I use your word, quotidian.
Yes. Well, I knew, of course, that there would be a question about caste. That's invariable. It's like giving a lecture on Gandhi. It's impossible to talk about Gandhi without someone throwing in a question about Ambedkar. Impossible today, whatever the subject may be about Gandhi. In this case, I'm sure Professor Roy will weigh in too, because she can go back to the past and look at the whole idea of the so-called caste system. I will only say this, that I think that the discussion on caste, and here I may be actually in a very small minority, I think that the discussion on caste needs to be really widened out in ways that have not been done even by the most radical Dalit scholars, frankly. I'm just putting it, I'm willing to say it very clearly, because I think that we have to actually understand what we mean by this institution, much less something called a caste system, right? What is it? What does that Varna and Jati mean? And what have they meant over a period of time? Why is it, for example, you see how I'm just laying the background a bit. Why is it, for example, that when so many institutions didn't survive colonial rule, why did what we call caste survive, right? And why is it that Mohandas Gandhi, I know the critique of what Gandhi is critiqued for, among many other things, and one of the things he's critiqued for is his Franklin declaration many times that he stood by, that he considered himself a Sanatan Dharmi, and he stood by the idea of Varna Ashram Dharam, right? But he was also very clear that he thought this had nothing to do with caste, by the way. So we'd have to see how he disaggregated that from something called caste, right? And this is my first segue into this, because I'm suggesting that you see, the question really expects me to buy into the whole parameter that the question has nothing to do with caste, by the way. So we'd have to see how he disaggregated. There's an echo coming here. Yeah. Okay. So that would be the first response I would have. And then secondly, I simply want to say that, yes, I think that if we take the conventional understanding of caste that we work with today, there is no question whatsoever that there is a long history of caste oppression and of caste atrocities. Whether that is genocide is a word that is thrown around too easily these days. I don't believe that we can call it genocide. I think there is systematic oppression. If we go with that understanding, there is systematic oppression, and there has been, certainly for a very long period of time. There are disabilities under which they suffer. And obviously then the kind of hospitality that I'm speaking of is not being extended to them. But within the same framework, let me also say, for example, there is a very recent book which I'm reading these days by a Japanese anthropologist, Akio Tanabe, which is on Orissa and caste, where he speaks about the difference between caste as ontological equality and caste as status and power. And the narrative that is being invoked by the question here has to do with caste as status and power. And there it seems to me that certainly in the exemplification of power there is no question. I would have to agree with the premises of the question if in that sense, that there certainly is systematic oppression. And we have not seen what I have described as the ethos of hospitality there. But I've already put in some other caveats, which we don't have, I think, time to explore here. But Professor Roy can weigh in because she has an understanding of caste in ancient India, which I'm certain I don't.
No, I don't think I have much to add, but I just thought it's useful for us to remember. And again, going back to some of the categories that I tried to introduce at the outset, when we're thinking about even single Janapadas, and if we look at them as differentiated terrains, both in terms of an urban area and a rural area, and forested areas, which seems to be something that is a possibility for most of the early states, it's important for us to remember that the social categories of the Varna Jati order would not operate in the same way in these three spatial categories. So you would have differences between the cities and the rural areas and the forest areas. And I think we somewhere in our discussions, we need to factor in that element of specificity and diversity in our understanding. And of course, it's useful for us to remember that in large areas of what is today India, for example, many parts of the Northeast as well as many parts of central India, the caste order, which we often take for granted as something which is constant and static, and of course it is extremely oppressive, would not have operated in the same way. And it's useful for us to keep those differences in mind. And the third and last thing I would like to add on this is that we have again a very strong, not always textualized tradition, which I think Professor Lal alluded to when he was talking about Joshi Bhushan Dasgupta, of the Tantric, Baul, Fakiri traditions, which operate on very, very different precepts. And they have survived at least for a millennium, if not more, where they work with reversals of conventionally understood gender, varna, jati categories, amongst other things. So that again is a tradition that we need to think about and we need to somewhere bring into our discussion so that it is not simply a discussion which is kind of overpowered by what we understand in terms of caste societies. So the fact that you have that continuous strand, which is extremely diverse in different parts of the country, I think is something that we also need to acknowledge and take on board somewhere. You are muted, Mr. Gagarin. You need to unmute.
Anyway, thanks a lot, ma'am. In fact, there are three questions. I found some sort of for pessimism, optimism, seesawing is going on here. The three I would like to pose at the same time so that both of you can see. Number one, why is the problem worse in the north than south? That is the first thing. Second thing is, do you see a time when our country would become free of the stranglehold, the extreme fringe that currently has in its throes? And the third one is, what are the appropriate measures to be taken to annihilate the inhuman caste system in modern context as the cultures are transforming globally from west to east? Annihilation of caste, problem between south and north, and when we would likely to get rid of this sort of unfortunate thing. These are the three things.
I will just briefly respond to some of this. I think it's perhaps again important for us not to get into a very easy north-south divide. And I think one of the reminders that we've had about this in recent times is the entire hijab controversy in Karnataka, which is something that several of us have been very troubled about. So I don't think the North-South divide operates in the very kind of neat and unproblematic way in which we're thinking about it. Once again, it's important for us to keep specificities in mind as well as keep the diversity in mind. In terms of annihilating the caste system, I think this is again a huge question where it is not within our purview to perhaps provide answers. Of course, we need to keep on working on the legal mechanisms of redress that we have and to see that these are implemented. But at the same time, there are obviously far more fundamental changes that are required within economy, within society. And as I was suggesting earlier, in terms of our everyday practices. So those are all areas which we need to think about, work on systematically and see how it goes. In terms of what we expect in the future, again, as I mentioned at the outset, no predictions are possible. But what we can hope for is that if people like you and people who are there in the audience manage to continue these discussions, carry these forward into other fora, extend it to those who I think in many other languages possibly, and to many other locations, that would probably be one way. It's unlikely that we will have any kind of instant, immediate resolution, but all we can do is perhaps persist in trying to do what we are doing and think about new and creative ways of addressing some of these issues. Thank you.
So, Professor Lal, would you like to respond, or shall we? Last two questions I'd like to take up. Then if you would like to respond to this, because these are important things, or we'll go to the next.
Well, I'll just be very brief, which is that I second what Professor Roy has said. You know, neither of us, no one else has a crystal ball. I don't know when we're going to get rid of the caste system, all of that, if we'll ever get rid of it. But I think what she has said, as I said, I entirely endorse. Let me just rephrase part of what she said in a slightly different way, which is that, you see, I think if you look at something like, take the Shaheen Bagh movement. The Shaheen Bagh movement is, in my view, one of the most extraordinary movements of the last 50, 100 years, anyway, not just in India. Because the people who carried that movement out are the people least expected, particularly by the Indian state, to carry out a movement. These are Muslim women. Not, by the way, all of them are just uneducated, which some people assume. There were professional Muslim women there too, by the way. I've looked at some of this quite closely. But, you know, various Muslim women, no leader, really orchestrated and led by Muslim women who invoked the constitution, as did the entire movement elsewhere, because there were Shaheen Baghs that came up all over the country, so to speak. But they did not restrict themselves to the constitution. We have to take recourse to the law, but the law can never be sufficient, because as Gandhi famously said when he was put on trial in 1922 on charges of sedition and convicted, there's a sentence there which is monumental. And he says, affection cannot be manufactured by the law. The law can tell you not to discriminate against another person. The law cannot tell you love the other person. No change comes about in any society, no fundamental change, only through law. Just look at examples all over the world. Look at the United States. You had the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, the Equal Housing Opportunity Act, all in the 1960s for African Americans. Did that relieve them of the suffering, the long history of oppression to which they have been subjected? No. Of course, it played a part, but they're far from being equal citizens on the ground. There is a difference between being formal citizens, which many Indians are, and citizenship on the ground. right? So the law cannot really be sufficient, right? And so therefore, is there ever going to be a time when we're going to be free of the menace? Well, as I said, apart from the fact that we don't have a crystal ball, this is something we have to think in generations. It's not going to happen overnight or anytime soon. And she's entirely right that we should be wary of this north-south thing. She, the whole case in Karnataka, the whole question of the Lingayats and all of that. But even other than that, I mean, there's so many other instances one can summon. But nonetheless, the question, I understand where the question is coming from, because there's long been a feeling that this is a problem particular to the Hindi belt, broadly speaking. The Gujarat is, that's why I said broadly speaking, because Gujarat is a problem, Maharashtra is a problem in various ways, but I think there the supposition is that Islam did not have the same set of relations. That's what's behind the question, but that would require a very long exploration. It did not have the same set of relations with other people, with Hindus or Buddhists, etc., in South India as it did in North India, right? And that I don't think is something that we can really address and resolve at this point in time.
Almost as a sequel or related, two things specially contemporary. The Gyanvapi mosque coexisting with Kashi Vishwanath temple in one vicinity ought to be a glorious example of India's cultural mosaic and the evolution of Indian society. How do we help popular imagination to see it for what it is? This is one. And the related thing, another thing is, may not be related, but still, what is the role of atheism in the composite culture? I thought both these things can be dealt together. Ma'am, would you like to say, or would?
I think, Professor Lal, if you could.
Well, so, I mean, on the question of atheism, I think it actually does have part, very much so. I mean, I had very briefly, when I was talking about the fact that, before, quote, Hindus, we started the word, who were there in India? There were Vaishnavas, Shaivais, Tantrics, and I mentioned Ajivikas and Charvakas. I mentioned that, you see, because it was partly in anticipation of this. You don't have to be a person of religious faith. In fact, I'm not, notwithstanding what I ended with, not a person of religious faith at all. But I think it is incumbent on us to understand those who have a religious faith. I think this was the problem of modern secular intellectuals in the West, who abandoned that whole sphere of religion. And I dare say some in India did the same. Some, not everyone. I think that's a fundamental error, intellectual error and ethical lapse in a way, you see. So the question of atheism is actually important. And here again, Gandhi is really, I mean, he's amazing. He can crop up in every conversation because of the extraordinary ecumenism. There is a book by Gora, which is a book of conversations by an atheist with Gandhi, who Gora visited and stayed with Gandhi in his ashram. And Gandhi was very much of the view that you did not at all have to read the scriptures or go to a temple or anything of that kind to declare yourself a Hindu, actually, right? So, or that you had to declare yourself a person of any faith whatsoever, right? This is what I really want to really stress. So I think that there is a long history there. I mean, I won't get into the whole question of what happened to the Charvakas and how they got kind of, obliterated or eviscerated from the memory of, so to speak. But, we'd have to then see how traces of them have always been around in a way. Okay. So that is what I would say on the question of atheism. And I forget what the first of the two questions was.
Gyanvapi, existing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, no, I mean, yes, yes, it is a very good example, but look at what they're trying to do. I mean, it's almost laughable. This whole Taj Mahal, Tejo Mahalya. I mean, by the way, this is not the first time this happened. There used to be a guy called P.N. Oak 50 years ago, who wrote a whole series of pamphlets where he was saying that no building of any merit in India attributed to Muslims has ever been built by Muslims. I mean, he was very clear about that, and he wrote a whole bunch of books on this. So I think, frankly, this is something that, comes out of many different things. This idea to try to say that, well, this mosques here, which are adjoining these are all impositions, they're later buildings. I would just want to argue hypothetically, let's supposing there were. Let's just suppose hypothetically that we agree with all these claims. Well, I mean, as far as I know, the Indian Monuments Act and our other legislation protects these. These are ancient buildings. I mean, that should be the end of the discussion. Yes, then you can put up a plaque and explain the history. Let's assume that you thought that this was, all a consequence of Muslim invasions, and mosques had been put up where temples were torn down, and this and that. But incidentally, I mean, this is what is called spoliage. This is a universal phenomenon. I mean, you go to Turkey, I can't tell you how many such buildings indicate this kind of thing, which is not to say that one simply exonerates any of that. If one took the view that, yes, indeed, this is what happened, let's supposing you take the Hindu nationalist view and say that, like the Babri Masjid, let's supposing you took the view. But I'm saying that now these should be protected monuments. And as far as the question in very direct terms is concerned, is this not an example of the cultural mosaic? I would say it is. Babri Masjid, I'll just conclude with that. The most interesting book from my standpoint, I know that this is not a book that my fellow creed of historians actually really take that seriously. The most interesting book that was written on this was by Ramchandra Gandhi. It's a book called Sita's Kitchen, where he was trying to suggest that, let's not say, oh, okay, you take the secular view. No, part of which was that, well, there is this history of spoliage that every, it's like other religions have done it to other religions. There's a history of it. Part of the argument was there's no evidence, right? And then we get obviously the Hindu view. What he did was something very interesting, where he said that we need to have a very different framework in which we think about these places. And what kind of site was it? So, for example, it was a site of Buddhists before. It's very clear it was, incidentally, okay, right? And so then he evokes the whole culture there of Buddhism, of the Charvakas. He sets up these kinds of imaginary dialogues there. I think that is far more interesting intellectually and ethically a way of thinking about this whole question that has now come up, because the whole question about the Gyanvapi Mosque and all of that has come up because of the recent discussions that are taking place and about the claims of these Muslims having encroached upon what were purely Hindu, structures, right? As is the case with the Taj Mahal, which of course wasn't a Hindu structure at all. But so there it's not a matter of encroachment even. It's simply a matter of, no, they don't want to believe that, well, this is a mausoleum that is put up, and it's an extraordinary one, put up by architects working with influences from large parts of the world, actually, But anyhow, I'll stop there.
Yeah. Anyway, by and large, all questions are only just 2 are remaining. Instead of leaving them, I'll read them out. Can you comment on the linguistic diversity and the evolution and disappearance of languages and dialects in the context of the language policy of the state? Also, 3-language formula in the educational policy. So this is one thing last we have there, and one more. What is this? India has given rise to different sects and religions, or many religions came to India from outside. How were the new religions and sects received by the established ones? How did the new ones change in response to the existing order? Of course, changing of language and religion both put together. These are the last two questions remaining. That is why I thought better read out, because many people are waiting, interested in listening to your views.
I think Professor Roy should take up these questions.
I quickly respond to them, and I'll just very briefly add on to what Professor Lal has said in the context of the earlier questions. One I was thinking is we've also had a very rich tradition of agnosticism, and somewhere to acknowledge that within strands of Buddhism as well as within strands of Jainism. So while you do have devotional traditions that emerged within both Buddhism and Jainism, and of course temples, etc., you also have that strand of agnosticism. And I think while we're talking about atheism, it's useful to keep that strand in mind as well as one more that we could think about. The other thing is, I think in terms of issues like the Gyanvapi and now Qutub Minar and Mathura, it's a never-ending list, really. And I think at one level, we are faced with a very immediate crisis where we do not have the space for the kind of reasoned discussion that we would ideally like to have. And I think that is, again, a constraint that we need to acknowledge. The way in which these matters are being taken up in the court, the way in which they're being resolved or not resolved, and the way in which a certain kind of mobilization is taking place around them. So while the need for a reasoned discussion remains, it may not be something that yields immediate results. And I think sometimes because we are expecting something to happen soon, it may be something that perhaps will not happen in the same way. And it's useful for us to keep that in mind. Coming to the issue of language, I think language, of course, is extremely complex and really blessed with the kind of diversity of linguistic families that we have. We have the so-called Indo-Aryan languages, we have the Dravidian, the Tibeto-Burman, the Austroasiatic, and several within these as well. So it's a very, very rich and diverse field. And I think that while languages do die out, languages also survive and transform in different ways. It's useful for us to keep in mind that part of the ways in which languages are come in and introduced are obviously through different kinds of political processes. For example, the fact that we are talking in English today is part of a certain kind of political experience that we share of colonialism and what went with it. So that is there. But apart from the political, there are other domains from which languages emerge, a whole range of cultural practices that need not necessarily be influenced very directly through political processes, as well as economic interactions which may or may not be completely controlled by the state. So while the state may have certain policies that they would like to implement, it's not that it will automatically fall in place, apart from the fact that we know that as of now, education remains on the concurrent list. So states have a say, just as the central government has a say in whatever educational policy is going to be framed. So there are those spaces that we need to think about. In terms of this issue of religious diversity and influences from outside, I think one of the issues that we need to keep in mind is that although we have been talking about diversity within the subcontinent, we also kind of fall back on the model of this being a unit that is there. And it's important for us to remember that within this subcontinent itself, we have had diverse traditions emerging at different points of time. And I'll just give two examples from the early period. One is the tradition of bhakti, which seems to have emerged in South India and then traveled northwards. So it's very interesting to see that within the subcontinent itself, if we do not treat it as one homogeneous block, you can see that there were these interactions taking place through very complex processes of people traveling through perhaps trade, perhaps pilgrimage, perhaps through armies, a whole range of processes, and you have that interaction taking place. And the other, which I would just very briefly highlight, is the emergence of Mahayana Buddhism. Again, this is not something which happens as a uniform kind of process, but if we look at the way in which Mahayana Buddhism emerges in the Northwest, which is in touch with Central Asia, with West Asia, with China, it gives us a certain context within which to look at the emergence of the Bodhisattva tradition. So it's not that it is the only way in which the Bodhisattva tradition emerges. You have other strands that go into it, but you can see that that is an example where perhaps you can see external influences coming in, a religious tradition that emerged in the Ganga Valley being transformed in different ways. And of course, as Buddhism spreads through Central Asia and East Asia on the one hand, and through Southeast Asia on the other hand, you have so many very different strands of Buddhism that emerge. So I think that gives us a sense also of the potential of interaction and the way in which that functions in different contexts. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ma'am, and thanks a lot, sir. It is really a wonderful session. In fact, all the people, many of the people were still eagerly waiting. Normally, last we used to have about 10, 15, but this time I think more people remained out of the 150 or whoever joined. And many compliments also came. Old stories and their insights are perhaps the best platforms to review and contextualize the present. Thanks, Anekdhara too. And one more thing came, Arvind Kumar's wonderful exposition, many unexplored dimensions. Thanks for organizing. Like this, it came very nice. Kumkum and Lal both represent red. Both of you have shown really red flag to extremists without taking extreme positions. Really very nice, sir. We are happy and sure this recorded version will be viewed by many people and understand the insights. In fact, early in the morning, we were worried. Our technical expert, Mr. Sadiq Ali, has cleared the problem. Otherwise, morning we would have faced a problem. Thanks a lot, and thanks all the audience for their contribution as well as raising questions out of the thought-provoking ideas you have given. And thank you, sir. Kindly inform about Anekdhara and the efforts we are making to all your students as well as in the academic community. Next seminar, or rather webinar, June 26th, last Sunday. Title is Sardar Patel, How Well Do We Know Him? And one of the speakers we have already fixed up, Professor Rajmohan Gandhi. Kindly tell about this also. We thank all the people whoever contributed in this wonderful success of the webinar. And we'll be in touch with both of you, ma'am and sir. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Pleasure to be.